Welcome to the Ray Hanania Radio Show, brought to you by the U.S. Arab Radio Network and sponsored by Arab News, the leading English language newspaper in the Middle East at arabnews.com. I'm Ray Hanania, your host. This week here at the Ray Hanania Show, we address the aftermath of the United Nations General Assembly's 79th session in New York City. First, with Arab News UN correspondent Ephrem Kossaify, who details for us all the many topics and challenges that the United Nations addresses. Ephraim is a phenomenal journalist, and his reporting on the United Nations, which is his main beat, is comprehensive, enlightening, and consequential. Then we speak with Brian Katulis, a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy at the Middle East Institute. Brian was formerly a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built the center's Middle East program and also worked on broader issues related to U.S. national security. The Middle East Institute also, by the way, just released Brian Katulis' most recent analysis called Strategic Drift, an assessment of the Biden administration's Middle East approach, topics that we speak with during his interview. The Ray Hanania Radio Show is broadcast live every Thursday at 5 p.m. on WNCK, AM 690 Radio, and on Monday at 5 p.m. in Michigan on the U.S. Arab Radio Network. It is also available online at arabnews.com/Ray Radio Show. Get more information on host myself, Ray Hanania, at arabnews.com or on my personal website at www.hanania.com. We will be right back after these messages with our guest, looking at the impact of the United Nations' recent sessions, its many goals to improve the world, and its efforts to address and resolve conflicts. We'll be right back right after these messages.
ArabNews.com, bringing you breaking news from across the Middle East and the latest on Arabs in America. Get inside the latest headlines with expert analysis and insights at ArabNews.com. Join over 5 million Facebook fans and over 10 million monthly readers. ArabNews.com. News that matters to you.
As the weather gets colder, it's a good idea to layer up with scarves, hats, and mittens. Another layer of protection this season is to get your flu and COVID-19 vaccines. You can get both vaccines at the same time. Talk to your healthcare provider or learn more at michigan.gov/COVID-flu-RSV. And layer up for some added peace of mind. A message from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
At Top Rehab Physical Therapy Clinic in Dearborn, we provide effective physical therapy sessions in order to limit pain and discomfort. Top Rehab provides physical therapy care for any diagnosis prescribed by a physician, and we regularly see and treat conditions such as stroke, TMJ, fibromyalgia, sciatica, joint pain, and more. We use a variety of pain management methods, including modalities, soft tissue mobilization, and therapeutic exercise. If you're in need of physical rehabilitation or physical therapy, get the highest quality health care at Top Rehab. Most insurance is accepted, and we're open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday 8 to 6, Tuesday and Thursday 8 to 5, and Saturday 10 till 2. Call for an appointment today at 313-846-0555. That's 313-846-0555. Choose Top Rehab Physical Therapy Clinic on Michigan Avenue in Dearborn. Life's too short to be in pain.
And now I'm really honored to be talking to not only a great reporter who is the Arab News correspondent covering the United Nations, but somebody I admire, I've known a long time, and he's a great writer, Ephrem Kossaify. Ephraim, thank you so much for joining me on the radio show.
Hi, Ray. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Listen, the United Nations has been the big focus of attention of the news for the last few weeks, and I figured there's nobody better to tell us what's happened at the UN than you. So thank you. Now, obviously, everybody's focused on Israel's attacks against Lebanon and Gaza. They seem to dominate the headlines, and we can talk a little bit about how that came up at the UN. But before we get into that, talk a little bit about the other headlines, because the UN does so much besides conflict resolution, addressing conflict. Tell us about some of those big stories that kind of got pushed aside because of this.
Yeah, for sure, Ray. Yeah, as you said, it's very accurate that even though Gaza and the war in Sudan and the war in Ukraine have again dominated the 79th session of the General Assembly, which ended on Monday, there still have been some positive headlines, or so does the UN like to say, including, for example, the 193 members of the UN coming together to adopt this Pact of the Future, which aims to revitalize the multilateral system and the institution of the United Nations, which has been struggling to tackle challenges like from climate change to wars in the Middle East and Ukraine. They have also adopted two other big declarations, one on the future generation, which seeks to enhance the role of youth in public and national decisions, and also the Global Digital Compact, as it's called, which grants the UN a still yet undefined role in governance of artificial intelligence. And also, Ray, WHO has also been leading on this. There's been a pact that was adopted as well, a political declaration on antimicrobial resistance, which, as Dr. Hanan Belkhi, who's the Saudi regional chief of the WHO, told us the other day in an interview, is a silent epidemic. So at least if you want to see the glass half full, you can look at these agreements that, even though it took very long and intense weeks and months of negotiations led by Germany and Namibia, member states have finally been able to come together to sign these three big declarations. And if you want, we can talk about the Security Council reforms part of the Pact of the Future, which I think is one of the most important things.
Let's do that, because explain a little bit about the Pact to the Future. Drill down just a little bit so people understand. What does that mean?
The Pact of the Future is it tackles, first of all, many different themes that the UN has been trying to deal with in the past decades, including reforming the financial architecture, enhancing global governance, seeking ways to enhance multilateral work between different governments and even non-governmental entities who want to be part of the decisions, and which the UN encourages to be to be at the decision tables. And it also deals with reforms of the Security Council. As you know, Ray, since the very beginning, since the actual inception of the United Nations, member states have been saying that the Security Council needs reform. This is, as they've been saying it, as back as 1945. And since the 1960s, there have been many debates on the issue, how to reform the council, how to address the problem of the veto, which, as the Kuwaiti ambassador who has led or co-led the intergovernmental negotiations on Security Council reforms in the past 2 years, has been telling us, since the 1960s, member states have been trying to tackle the Security Council reforms, but in the past 2 years, the debates have considerably intensified and became more serious. And what Kuwait and Austria tried to do in leading these negotiations is to make them more transparent. Because all the debates that happened prior to these to the past 2 years, all those debates have happened at a certain time, and because of the turnover of diplomatic missions, every new mission would come and have to start anew. Now everything is transparent. There's a depository of all the debates, of where each member state stands on the issue. So at least we have that now, thanks to Kuwait and Austria and the way they worked in the past. Everything has been televised as well.
Just before you go into that, that's an important aspect, because I know a lot of people, when I hear them talk about the UN, and obviously I don't cover the UN fully the way you do, but they talk about how the Security Council is the power and the General Assembly is the voice. So the General Assembly can say whatever they want, but if someone on the Security Council disagrees, it goes nowhere, right?
Yes, exactly. And that's majorly because of the power of the veto. And as you say, even though it is the most powerful body of the UN, it has been paralyzed for a while, especially when it comes to Gaza. Out of the 80 vetoes that the United States has cast over the past decades, at least 40 of them have been cast to prevent any action against Israel in the occupied territories and to prevent any action on the ground. 5 of those vetoes have been cast within the past year. As we saw, the US has vetoed every ceasefire resolution. And even when it was adopted, when the Security Council adopted the 3 resolutions, one having to do with humanitarian relief for the people in Gaza, the US abstained to let it pass, but also undermined it further by saying that Security Council resolutions are non-binding. If you remember, this was a huge controversy at the UN. The Security Council is supposed to have the force of international law behind it. It is even allowed to use Chapter 7, to use force in order to implement its resolution. But as you said, it has been paralyzed because these 5 big powers have the prerogative of the veto. They can block any action that doesn't suit their geopolitical position. And this is what the Kuwaiti ambassador said as well to Arab News. 1 or 2 countries cannot be allowed anymore to block the path of peace when the majority of member states want the path to peace, as we saw also in the General Assembly.
Yeah, that's a really big issue. I'm glad you touched on it and you talked to members, about that. So obviously that is a big topic that they're talking about.
Yeah.
And then there's another one that we always talk about, SDGs. I don't want to pass that up because those are significant, aren't they? Explain what the SDG stands for and what does it touch on?
The SDGs have been adopted in 2015 by the UN. This is a set of goals that aim to basically eradicate poverty, enhance education around the world, under the slogan of no one will be left behind. You have a goal on climate, you have a goal on education, you have a goal on water and sanitation and everything that is needed for a world that's healthier and where the downtrodden finally get to have a normal life. Gender equity as well. But the UN has been lamenting for the past years that there are huge setbacks to these SDGs, and UNGA in its 79th session, just as every year, tries to bring these goals into focus, see where the world has been stalling on these goals, and also seek ways of revitalizing them and give them a new life. We are left with 6 years, I think, until the world can meet those goals. But as I said, we are experiencing major setbacks. And this is not just an issue for member states. The private sector plays a huge role in also dealing with the SDGs and their importance. We did an interview with the CEO of the Gates Foundation, for example, and they have been focused this year on malnutrition and the huge economic consequences for having this amount of people in the world, in the millions, go hungry, while the solutions are really at hand and they're not that complicated if there is just the political will to implement those resolutions. But as I said, and as you said in the beginning of your show, Gaza, the war, the conflicts in the region, the war in Ukraine, in Sudan, have again been undermining the SDGs, and the light and the spotlight was supposed to be on the SDGs this year as well.
When you say they undermine the SDGs and the goals, and I think, what are they called? Sustainable development goals, I think, and they were adopted years ago, like 2015. So I remember being there in 2019 covering the UN. And I remember telling the editor, I don't ever want to cover this place again. It's too much. Send Ephraim, my friend, to do it. He wants a lot of work. But is it because of the fact that these conflicts take attention away from the SDGs, or is it because these countries sometimes are in conflict together, or is it because they impact things like the climate change, or bringing up the youth, and everybody is at a different level of evolution, as a society?
It's all of those reasons that you just mentioned right now together. These conflicts as well are causing hunger, malnutrition, for example. Climate change as well is driving people away from homes, impacting education, impacting women and children are usually the ones that suffer the brunt of that when that happens. Conflicts also, we have seen, for example, in the case of Sudan, how conflict undermines the progress for women as well.
Right.
We have been talking about scandalous stories of mass rapes happening, for example, in Sudan. All these
Wow.
things are interlinked together. You have the energy as the goal as well, energy, clean energy for all, that we're still very, late in that process of, renewable energy in the world. All of it is very much interlinked together, and no SDG can be achieved without all the others.
Let's talk now a little bit about the conflicts that have taken place in the Middle East. They've had the attention of everybody, including the UN. There was a lot of talk about that. I remember as I was watching the UN, listening to speeches, I saw a lot of members of the General Assembly who had so many other issues about their countries take a minute to speak about the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. That isn't, it seems like that topic is a big issue with members of the General Assembly, more so than the Security Council. Tell us a little bit about that. Does Palestine have are they recognized as a full member or a partial member?
It's interesting. Palestine just got an upgrade in its membership this year based on a General Assembly resolution. They now are sitting in an alphabetical order, just like everybody else.
Wow.
In the General Assembly. The General Assembly really showed up for the Palestinian issue this year many, many times. Whenever the Security Council failed Gaza, the resolution or the issue was taken up by the General Assembly based on the request of the very active Palestinian envoy here, Riyad Mansour. And the General Assembly has voted in its huge majority for a ceasefire, for Palestinian statehood, for the ICJ advisory opinion to be implemented as soon as possible, and for Israel to withdraw from the West Bank within a year. Although the General Assembly resolutions are not binding, yet you can tell, Ray, the importance of such resolutions in showing where the world stands on the issue, which again highlights the paralysis of the Security Council, where we see one member state blocking the action of the will of over 140 other member states of the General Assembly. So Gaza is not just the humanitarian suffering that we're seeing and how it's really weighing on the conscience of the world, as UN officials keep repeating. It's also the ways in which Gaza has shown the really weaknesses of the UN system with the Security Council, the dangers of keeping this veto power without any challenge, and the dysfunction basically that is causing this multilateral institution, the only one we have in the world.
I saw when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu got up to speak, many members got up in protest to his speech. And as you say, maybe the resolutions are not enforceable, but they do carry a lot of moral weight and legal weight in terms of embracing the international rule of law. Tell me a little bit about the Arab world as a voice at the UN. How strong is the voice of the Arab world? And maybe a little bit also about Saudi Arabia plays a big role in a lot of the projects and efforts there. But talk about the Arab world first. How formidable is the Arab world voice at the UN?
They've been united, we have seen this picture over and over again of the Palestinian envoy surrounded by all his Arab colleagues, and they've all been speaking in one unified voice. against the aggression on Gaza and calling for a ceasefire, calling for accountability. They have been united. Maybe to give you like the epitome of the Arab position, I think it was very evident in the Jordanian foreign ministers at the stakeout of the Security Council the other day prior to the meeting, when he said, all of us Arab nations, we are ready to secure Israel's security. And I'm saying it from now, from the stakeout, if Israel implements the two-state solution and gives Palestinians their state and end these wars, we are all ready to have peace with Israel. I think that was the strongest statements, and it epitomizes where the Arab world stands right now in relation to Israel and to the conflict. This is, of course, in a reply or to reply to Israel's claims that no one wants peace with it, and it's surrounded by aggressive neighbors who only want to do it harm. So the Arab position was very clear in response to that no, they want peace. You asked about the Saudi efforts as well. I think mentioning Netanyahu, as you remember in his speech, he spent a good amount of time talking about Israel's desire to have peace with Saudi Arabia along the lines of the Abraham Accord. And he dwelled really a long time on that, trying to flesh out all the positive outcomes of such a deal. And immediately after, Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan spoke to us reporters, and we asked him about what he thought of Netanyahu's speech, the part of the speech related to a deal with Saudi Arabia. And he said that what was interesting in his pretty lengthy speech is that he hasn't mentioned Palestinians. And he reiterated one more time, and he said it very clearly, without a Palestinian state, that's never going to happen. He was very clear about it. So I think the Arab world in general, the Saudis in particular, in addition to that, they've been pushing for recognition of Palestine across the board, with working with so many other member states. They have been united like never before behind the Palestinian cause at the UN.
Yeah, I covered Prince Farhan's speech to the General Assembly and was very impressed by how that was a major issue. And as you pointed out, that is a major position that the Saudis are trying to make. In the final, we got a minute left or two, but any final thoughts, anything that I didn't bring up that you think shouldn't be ignored or should be remembered that comes out of this UNGA 79?
Just like the Swiss ambassador just said right now, before I spoke with you, that if you want to look at the glass half empty, then you can say everyone was gathering in New York, and while people are gathering here and world leaders are talking about peace and resolution of conflicts, Israel began attacking Lebanon and a ground invasion into Lebanon, right when world leaders were calling for a ceasefire and for an end to this conflict. And if you want to see the glass half full, then you can say that at least 193 member states still have a place to convene together, and this is the only place in the world where they can do so. And despite all the challenges and disagreements and geopolitical divisions, they were able to adopt a pact for the future, declaration on the role of youth, a commitment to reform the Security Council, even if it's just in words, and also a commitment to fight the next, as they say, silent epidemic, which is microbiological resistance.
So I know that now that the United Nations General Assembly 79, UNGA 79, has technically ended, the UN continues, though, with meetings pursuing and following up all these issues that you talked about then, moving forward.
For sure. On Wednesday now, for example, because of the Iranian attacks on Israel on Tuesday, There's an emergency security council meeting that is being scheduled right now, for example. And October is a very busy month at the UN anyway. That's when all the committees meet. The budget committee, the humanitarian committee, all these various committees meet and chart their path for the next year. So there's a lot of work in October. It's the busiest month at the UN after UNGA.
My guest, Ephrem Kossaify, Ephraim, you did a phenomenal job summarizing in less than 20 minutes for the radio show all that the UN does. They do a lot. They address a lot. Sometimes it isn't, everything that we want, but they are bringing up the issues that the world needs to address. Ephrem Kossaify, the Arab News correspondent covering the United Nations, my guest. Thank you, Ephraim.
Thank you, Ray. My pleasure.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our interviews here at the Ray Hanania Radio Show. We will be right back right after these messages.
ArabNews.com, bringing you breaking news from across the Middle East and the latest on Arabs in America. Get inside the latest headlines with expert analysis and insights at ArabNews.com. Join over 5 million Facebook fans and over 10 million monthly readers. ArabNews.com, news that matters to you.
With more than 30,000 successful in vitro fertilizations, IVF Michigan is now ranked as one of America's best fertility clinics according to Newsweek magazine. IVF Michigan fertility centers are the recognized leaders in high-quality fertility care. With locations in Bloomfield Hills and 9 other cities in Michigan and Ohio, IVF has experts in all aspects of the field. A founding member, American board-certified Dr. Nicholas Shama, is one of the leading reproductive endocrinologists in Michigan and Ohio. He has performed over 20,000 successful IVF cases, and it's helped thousands of couples fulfill their dreams of parenthood. When it's time to get personalized care from Dr. Nicholas Shama at one of America's best fertility clinics, call IVF Michigan Fertility Centers in Michigan and Ohio toll-free at 855-952-9600. 855-952-9600. Life for Relief and Development has now been rated as one of the best charities for humanitarian aid. Life's humanitarian projects span the globe, and Life is celebrating its 30th anniversary of providing essential life-saving aid to people and communities in 36 countries, regardless of race, color, religion, or cultural background. Where there is life, there is hope. And when disaster occurs here or around the world, including being one of the first responders to the Turkey-Syria earthquake crisis, Life for Relief and Development rushes in to provide food, medical aid, and shelter to those in need. We are looking to help the earthquake victims, and we take 0% overhead on emergency donations. So please help improve these efforts. Learn more about our involvement to help the helpless and bring hope where it's needed most, and make your tax-deductible donation to Life for Relief and Development now at lifeusa.org or call 248-424-7493. That's 248-424-7493.
Hey Michigan, let's think beyond the sink and learn where the water your family drinks every day comes from. Private wells and public water supplies allow homes across Michigan to draw water from different sources like lakes, rivers, and groundwater. Tap into the facts about your home's water source and learn about your home's water quality to protect your family's health. Visit michigan.gov/care for MI drinking water. A message from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
And now I'd like to introduce my guest, Brian Katulis. He is a senior fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Middle East Institute. He was formerly a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built the center's Middle East program and also worked on broader issues related to U.S. national security. The Middle East Institute, by the way, just released Katulis' most recent analysis called Strategic Drift, an assessment of the Biden administration's Middle East approach. Welcome to the program, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So obviously got a couple issues. One of them may kind of dovetail into your release and a recent analysis that just came out Wednesday. But first, I wanted to talk about the United Nations. I think the question a lot of people have today is the United Nations still relevant?
I think it's a question people have been asking for many years now, particularly since the UN did nothing on issues like the Syrian civil war for more than a decade. The challenge with the current structure of the United Nations is that it does in many ways reflect the international balance of power. And you have obstructionist countries like Russia, like China and others that actually won't move in particular ways to actually act when governments like the Syrian regime were killing their people in the tens of thousands. So the UN met last week. It's hard for me to see what they've actually produced on some of the key fronts, whether it was trying to stop conflict in the Middle East, and trying to prevent sort of the spread of conflict in places like Sudan. So I do think it plays an important role on key issues. For instance, recently there was a polio outbreak in Gaza, and there are committed development professionals that work in parts of the UN. So it's an imperfect structure, but on the big ticket items, quite often it's what countries and the most powerful countries are doing that shape the landscape and not what is said at the United Nations.
Yeah, it sounds like they do a lot in terms of humanitarian effort, identifying strategic development goals, which is their SDGs, things that would help different countries. They give a voice, certainly, to a lot of countries that are smaller. But when it comes to conflict, I mean, wasn't that the purpose of setting up the United Nations, to prevent another World War III from taking place? This happened. They put it together right after the end of World War II. And it seems over the last 30 years, the UN has been kind of on the sidelines of the conflict. I remember a time when they had a UN peacekeeping force that had the power to step in and separate forces. We don't seem to see that anymore. Have they been weakened in terms of that aspect of their ability to influence and prevent conflict?
Well, certainly there are peacekeepers from the United Nations in multiple arenas around the world. And part of the reason we don't hear about them is, to a certain extent, some would argue they're having an impact in those places. It's those problem areas where the issues are just so acute. We see it with Israel and Hamas and the war in Gaza. We see it now these days in Lebanon, and there's a UN force there. It doesn't do much in a context where you have countries and also sub-state actors like Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's not capable of doing it because it doesn't have the mandate nor the willpower, political will, or firepower to do much about it. So we can lament the system, and certainly there are faults and weaknesses, and I criticize it as well. But in certain instances, it has played key constructive roles. And we often forget the success stories because they were successes, right?
Right.
And but the fundamental challenge is that in a world today that is very much multipolar, there are different voices, especially China, playing its own games through the United Nations. There are countries like Iran that have the audacity to sit on the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, and they use it for their own purposes as opposed to some sort of bigger ideal, which I think initially drove its founding after the World War II. You take the good with the bad in places like institutions like the UN, and you try to make the most of it. But unfortunately, it's hard to point to a major success story in recent years.
Would it be a fair criticism, though, to say, however, that the UN has been incapable of impacting in a positive way what's happening, for example, in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza and Hamas, and Israel and Lebanon, and now the recent outbreak with Yemen? It doesn't seem like they have the ability to do anything other than, speak about the moral issues and give a lot of speeches and raise money and provide funding. What can they do?
Yeah, well, they're doing a lot, I think, at a popular level. If you ask Palestinian refugees that live in Jordan and Lebanon and Gaza and other places, and they offer educational services. And of course, there's been, I think, justifiable criticisms of the quality of that education and what's being taught. But there's certain things that we here in America, because we have such a great system and great economy, we just take for granted. And the UN agencies play, I think, an important role. Again, a lot of it is stopgap, but it does save lives, as we were talking about sort of the polio outbreak in Gaza. On the bigger picture questions, what I would say, easy enough to point the finger to the United Nations, but I would also point the finger to every single other major power, including the United States, China, powers in the region. They've not been able to arrest the spiral down into conflict and a regional war that I think is breaking out across the Middle East. Started with the Hamas attack against Israel on October 7th, but it's just spread. So, fine to point to the finger to the United Nations, but the United States has not done that great of a job in stopping this. And I would also argue a lot of the regional powers and also other global powers like Russia and China haven't been so good. And it's for one reason. It's that the combatants in these conflicts in the Middle East see fit to actually use force, military force, power in that way, in some cases terrorism and terror strikes, to advance their interests. And that's the unfortunate consequence of the era we live in right now.
I think the world's changed, though, when the United Nations was founded in the right after World War II in the late 1940s. And today, the structure reflected more of what was happening in 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. But today, where every country feels that they deserve more equality, they should have a stronger voice, it seems like that the real power is in the Security Council. And that's kind of a remnant from the post-World War II effort to kind of keep the allies together and in control of the world, the critics might say. Is there a need to change that imbalance between the Security Council and the General Assembly, for example? Because nothing gets done in the General Assembly in terms of conflict without the backing of the Security Council.
Yeah, I mean, people have talked about UN reform for decades, especially in the post-Cold War era when the Soviet Union collapsed, and the need to actually bring different voices in, including the idea of that India, which is a major democracy and a large populous country, doesn't have a permanent voice in the way that other countries do. But the problem with trying to effectuate change in the UN system is that it's sort of like trying to effectuate change in our own political system here in America. To make big changes, you actually have to get some sort of consensus from any number of countries to actually make those changes. And what happens is quite often then when the UN system doesn't work, then countries band together in multilateral or minilateral efforts to try to shape the context in ways that they best can. So yes, the UN was born in a particularly different era at the start of the Cold War. Here we are 25 years plus after the end of the Cold War. And we've had probably, decades worth of UN reform plans coming from think tanks or coming from the UN itself, but none are implemented because it goes back to the central question that plagues the Middle East today. Where's the political will to actually implement those changes that builds a consensus? And I'm afraid to say that, like, as awful as things seem with multiple conflicts from the Ukraine war to what's going on in the Middle East, to tensions in the South China Sea, it's going to take something cataclysmic to actually focus the minds towards the major reforms that a body like the United Nations needs to undertake.
Do you think I'm being unfair to say, though, that the UN isn't really doing anything in terms of affecting the conflicts in the Middle East, for example, or even Ukraine? It's really being done by Israel and the United States, the Arab world in the Middle East, and the European Union with the United States and Russia and their allies, in Europe, Eastern Europe. It doesn't seem like the UN is playing a major role. Do you think I'm being unfair to say that?
No, but it's also not ahistorical, right? Think back to major other conflicts that the United States was involved with, whether it's the Korean War at the outset or of the founding of the UN, but Vietnam. Quite often, it's just nation states that actually are advancing their interests in the arena. It's the most international arena, and it's the powerful ones that are doing that. So, I do believe that these institutions in the UN, international institutions, still play an important role in facilitating conversations, finding solutions on human security needs, as we talked about the development goals and other things like this. But when it comes to core power interests of different nation states, quite often they play themselves out through unilateral means or mini or multilateral means.
So over the years, I know the General Assembly has passed many resolutions that have become the foundation for the discussion of peace. But they're not really enforceable, are they?
No, there's no mechanism to enforce them. I mean, in certain instances, I remember in the case of Libya, there was an arms embargo after the Gaddafi regime was in power, and then afterwards. And there are efforts to sanction, but quite often what's really needed to impose sort of stability is some sort of victory on the military battlefield. Like it's hard to legislate these things through UN resolutions to get to peace and stability. Anyone who argues otherwise is not paying attention to how the real world works.
So the UN could play a role. In other words, when a conflict comes to a halt or a pause, to help expand that to peace and support bringing the two sides together. But technically, it can't really stop a conflict then, I guess.
No, I mean, the government authorities in particular places, if they're strong enough, should be able to stop a conflict. As we see in the conflict unfolding in Lebanon right now, you basically have a weak, barely existent government authority that's been dominated by a terrorist group, Hezbollah.
And just final question about the United Nations. Just to go back to the principle I was trying to push to, do you think it needs change to make it more impactful, or do you think that it has the role that it was assigned and it's doing it very well?
Of course it needs change. It's just this chicken and egg conundrum of how do you get to that change if you don't have enough political will from key member states to actually make those fundamental reforms. So every institution, I think our government, America's, is the best in the world. There's no other that's better than this, but it still can be improved upon. So
the war in the Middle East, it really kind of much more aggravated this time than it has been in prior years. It's true. Hamas committed an atrocity in attacking Israel on October 7th, and we're coming up to a year of what many on the Palestinian or Arab side would say are atrocities also that are far graver than what happened on October 7th. How do we get out of this? Because it hasn't cycled out. It seems to be getting worse now, drawing Lebanon in, now drawing Syria in. The technology has given Israel pretty strong advantage over some of these Arab countries, and it's exacted some, pretty deadly achievements over the past year. How do we get out of this? Do you see an end to this?
I think a key part, and there's no one silver bullet here, unfortunately, because it's a complicated conflict on multiple fronts. I think a key part of it is global powers like the United States working with key partners in the Middle East, Arab partners that actually have been more than willing to actually do things like put their neck out to advance the idea, once again, of a state of Palestine as part of a two-state solution. And I think the conflict has focused their minds in places like Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. They know it, and these are countries, Jordan and Egypt at least, that forged peace agreements themselves with Israel in a different era. But I think a key part of trying to create some light at the end of the tunnel in this awful set of conflicts right now is that the United States can and should lead, but it needs to be part of a team, if you will, in the Middle East, because those Arab partners and other countries that have said they're willing to, A, work with the United States to thwart threats coming from Iran and its networks, but then B, advance the notion of an end state to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that gives full security and justice and rights to Palestinians. They're going to be a key part of the equation, because especially in the United States, no matter who wins our election in a few weeks, we're going to have other issues, right? We've got immigration, we've got economic issues, we've got abortion, questions about our own democracy. So we're going to need to work as a team with some of these Arab partners that in the past maybe weren't as active as they are today. And they're more than willing, I think, to step up. And that's one argument. I think I think whether it's a Harris or a Trump administration, they need to listen more to our Arab partners and the people of the Arab world to actually effectuate the solutions that actually can stick.
And it's kind of ironic because now I have not read your analysis, but the title kind of gives me a little direction in terms of where it was going. It was released yesterday on Wednesday. The title is Strategic Drift, an Assessment of the Biden Administration's Middle East Approach. I'm assuming that the U.S. Biden administration approach has been drifting away or weakening. Is that a proper interpretation? Again, I have not read it.
Yeah, I mean that's what it's a constructive criticism of the Biden administration, but I would argue the previous administrations, the Trump administration, the Obama administration, in their own way, have acted erratically and made sort of gestures that confuse the region. And this is not a partisan statement, but basically, since the George W. Bush invasion of Iraq, and then the sense that we overreached, that there's been an attempt to swing the pendulum backwards. But every time a US president tries to do that and tries to disengage from the region and operates with this assumption that less is more, they have what I call their Michael Corleone moment for the Middle East. Every US president has one. It comes from Godfather 3, when Marco Corleone says, just when I thought I was out, I get pulled back in. And Joe Biden has had his moment here too as well, because he spent the first year more or less trying to clean up the mess from the coronavirus and the economic shutdown that came with that. But then, when you look to the world, he was looking at 3 C's, China, COVID, and climate were his priorities. But towards the end of his term, he's going to find that he's doing crisis management. And that crisis management is in part very tactical, and it's a direct result of the administration's unwillingness to engage more deeply in the region with a more coherent regional security approach linked to diplomacy. So there's a lot of wishful thinking, but main point here is that the report articulates what I think is a fair assessment of how the Biden administration has approached the Middle East for nearly 4 years, but it's not all that dissimilar from its predecessors. I mean, we can argue different things like Trump's Abraham Accords or Obama's engagement to respond to the ISIS crisis or the Iran nuclear deal. But the broader contours have been the US saying we're going to pivot or rebalance to other parts of the world, whether it's Asia or China or to home. And every time we do that, we actually end up causing more challenges for ourselves, because we then reduce the trust and confidence and leverage that we have with some of our partners in the region.
And again, I should ask you if you want to do. I think you did give us kind of a summary of what the analysis says. If there's any more to it, I'd love for you to add to it, because I think it's the Middle East Institute. Your analysis have always been critical to understanding issues like in areas like the Middle East. So I'd love to give you an opportunity if you want to say a little bit more about that analysis, and recommend that our listeners go to the Middle East Institute, and I'll make sure to put the website on the radio and the YouTube so they can do that. But what maybe some other points that you didn't touch on that you think should be mentioned?
Well, this is part of a series, and this is the fourth of a series of reports I've done in the last year with support from colleagues. And I actually give, in the last few reports, letter grades. So like a professor does or a teacher does in school, on how the Biden administration can be evaluated according to their own goals. Their own goals in responding to the Hamas attack on Israel and the war that it led to. Their top goal was the support of Israel's self-defense and eliminating the threat posed by Hamas. And people can agree or disagree with it, but in word, deed, and action, that's been a top priority. And latest grade we give them is a B, because for all of the debate about trying to use U.S. Military support for Israel as leverage to try to get to a ceasefire and things like this, the Biden administration, by and large, has been reluctant to use that for a variety of reasons. But other goals, like securing this safe return of hostages, preventing a regional war, it's not done a very good job. And then particularly on responding to the humanitarian crisis and protecting civilians in Gaza, now increasingly in places like Lebanon. There's a lot of rhetoric, but there's not actual policy mechanisms to achieve those goals. A couple of things I'd say also is there's bigger picture recommendations. It's not just assessing the current record. It's hoping to offer some lessons learned from this period for whomever wins the presidency in 2024 and enters office in 2025. And a key sort of lesson is the U.S. should actually state what it wants to achieve in the Middle East rather than what it doesn't want to achieve, right? So a lot of the mistakes that are made in U.S. policymaking on foreign policy is to say, we don't want this to happen. We don't want there to be a terror attack. We don't want there to be a war. But it doesn't yet articulate what it would take to actually achieve peace or to achieve an end to the terror groups that are challenging the security in different places. And another key sort of challenge, which we highlight in a key lesson, is, and I mentioned this earlier, is that the United States cannot go it alone. There are so many actors in the region, Arab countries and others, that are looking for partners as opposed to someone telling them what to do. And that's a key part of the conversation for helping set a new future for the Middle East, is listening to those countries that are actively trying to respond to the situation that they're living in that part of the world, respond to their own people. And the United States, rather than coming in as some sort of outside power and giving them marching orders, we actually should have more of a conversation with some of our most reliable partners across the region. We don't do that nearly enough. And I hope whomever wins the presidency, we do that more, because it helps us create force multipliers in diplomacy and military action and other things when we're working with others.
And the point before this last one that you just made kind of reminded me of American election politics. I've covered American politics for 45 years, and covering City Hall in Chicago and Illinois and Midwest politics. And the one thing I've learned is a lot of voters don't vote for someone, they vote against somebody.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that's almost what's been happening, that type of attitude towards issues.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate, because when you cast your agenda, what you're trying to advocate for, mostly in the negative, then you end up actually, I think, prioritizing those things or focusing so much on those things that you don't want to happen. So case in point, for those like me who support the Palestinian people and want there to be a two-state solution and a state of Palestine created, I understand why this is the case, especially in the context of this vicious war over the last year. But more energy and activity is focused on trying to prevent and stop what Israel's doing, which is a key part of the equation, but it's only part of it, right? It's all then what comes next, and who's going to lead Palestine, and how does it fit within sort of the regional system there? What's our vision for the future? And we're quite often on Middle East policy stuck in a moment that we can't get out of.
And the final question, Brian, again, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. Your observations are always very, very helpful, not just for me, but the audience. Do you see any change happening as a result of the presidential election? In other words, do you think the presidential election is that important that it might cause change in the Middle East, or is it just going to shift things around a bit?
I think if you look at the history of transitions from one administration to the other on foreign policy, partisans don't like this point quite often, but there's usually more consistency between administrations. Yes, there are shifts sometimes within administrations, but rare is the moment. And in this instance, I think the drivers of main events in the Middle East are the actors in the Middle East, and the U.S. can play a different role, and we offer suggestions at the Middle East Institute about how it could shift its policy approach. But I do think, I don't want to get too political here, but I do think there's a difference in style between the two candidates, the leading candidates for president. Donald Trump prided himself when he was president, but also as a politician, as one who uses his unpredictability to gain leverage with adversaries as well as allies alike. Remember, he's the man who met with the leader of North Korea, and he would have easily met with Iran's supreme leader and had tried desperately to do so back in 2018 in New York. So he's a bit more unpredictable, and I think that formula added to today's region, which is quite unpredictable, is an interesting exercise. He argues on the campaign trail that he would make a deal, pretty rapidly to end all of these conflicts, but he often doesn't elucidate how he would go about doing that. So that's, I think, his style. I think the tone and style of Harris will be quite similar to Biden when it comes to Middle East issues, though some people have noted that she sounds sometimes more empathetic towards Palestinians and some concern. But I think if I would characterize Trump as unpredictable, I think Harris and her template is a bit more technocratic, managerial sort of style of things, but not really trying to shape events, mostly trying to respond to events. And those different styles matched up with where I think the center of gravity is in the action in the region, which is in the region. It will be an interesting mix to contemplate and deal with. So I think, long story short, it does matter who leads America. It will produce different postures, but it matters a lot less than I think the political debates during a campaign season seem to highlight. And it's a bit more about the style of governance and whether or not which leader and which administration can build stronger relationships with some of our partners in the Middle East.
And as the British would say, your analysis is brilliant, is the word the British love to use. I'm always impressed by it. My guest, Brian Katulis, Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Middle East Institute, formerly a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built the center's Middle East program and also worked on broader issues related to U.S. national security. And of course, yesterday, Wednesday, the Middle East Institute released Katulis's most recent analysis called Strategic Drift and Assessment of the Biden Administration's Middle East Approach, which I'm looking forward to reading myself. Brian, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thanks, Ray. Great to be with you.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our interviews here at the Ray Hanania Radio Show. We will be right back right after these messages.
ArabNews.com, bringing you breaking news from across the Middle East and the latest on Arabs in America. Get inside the latest headlines with expert analysis and insights at ArabNews.com. Join over 5 million Facebook fans and over 10 million monthly readers. ArabNews.com, news that matters to you.
Are you going to start a restaurant or a grocery store soon? Do you need floor plans and designs? Call Naji Abood at 734-744-9796. Do you want to buy kitchen and restaurant equipment at discount prices? Call Naji Abood now, 734-744-9796. New Concept Products and Design, the trademark of kitchen equipment. 5% discount on all purchases of $75,000 or more. New Concept Products and Design, new location, 31185 Schoolcraft in Livonia. Learn more at www.newconceptproducts.com. Call Naji Abood, 734-744-9796.
Get ready for an amazing experience at Ishtar Restaurant on 15 Mile Road in Sterling Heights. Enjoy excellent hospitality from owners Ali Al-Baghdadi and Fatty Bonham, serving the best in Mediterranean food. Try Chef Ali Al-Baghdadi's famous shawarma, the best Iraqi grills and food, and the best Arabic and international dishes. Dine in our authentic atmosphere or take out. Call 586-698-2585 or check us out on Facebook. Ishtar Restaurant practices all CDC guidelines and is open every day 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. Have an amazing experience today at Ishtar Restaurant, 3625 15 Mile Road, Sterling Heights.
Ziyad brand. Quality products from our family to yours. Ziyad Brothers Importing offers the finest quality products, including brands like Sultan, Kraft, Nestle, Hook, Rico Picon, Dana, and many more. Ask your retailer to carry these fine products because you deserve the very best. For more information, visit our website at www.ziyad.com. That's www.ziyad.com. Ziyad, quality products from our family to yours.
Thank you for listening to the Ray Hanania Radio Show, brought to you by the U.S. Arab Radio Network and sponsored by Arab News, the leading English language newspaper in the Middle East at ArabNews.com. This season, the Ray Hanania Radio Show focuses on the U.S. presidential elections, the battle between the major party candidates, former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris, and the third party contenders who could push the election into the House, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Dr. Jill Stein. We'll be back next Thursday with more special guests to help us understand the role Arab and Muslim voters in America are playing in the presidential election. Check out our page at arabnews.com/Ray Radio Show for all of the programs that we've recorded and all of the story links that have been written about the program. And also you can go to my website at hanania.com, Hanania, hanania.com for my columns, my radio shows, my podcasts, and all my writing at Arab News. Have a great week, everybody. See you next Thursday. Good evening.